Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to break down complex research and we'll give you the knowledge you need to really understand the issues. Today, we're tackling something huge, a fundamental reality of global urbanization. We're talking about the incredible challenge of providing safe water in these rapidly growing cities, where the infrastructure just can't keep up with all the people moving in.
It's a defining struggle right now, absolutely. I mean, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it's pretty stark. About, 39%? Still lacking access to improved water sources. And when populations explode in cities, the formal systems, well, they inevitably get overwhelmed. They just can't serve everyone. You get this massive gap between demand and supply, and something has to step in to fill that void.
Right. And we're going to zoom in today on a really fascinating case study to understand how this actually works, or maybe how it doesn't work and what springs up instead. We're focusing on Kisumu, Kenya, a city that saw, get this, an 80% population boom in just the decade before the study, pushing it close to 1 million people.
And that kind of growth, it basically caused a system collapse for water. The city's official utility, kiosks, they reported back in 2007 that the demand for water was nearly 3 times what they could actually produce.
3 times. Wow.
Yeah. So that means the formal system, the pipes to your house, it's only serving a tiny fraction of the population.
Okay, so that sets up our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack this hidden, almost shadow economy, the informal water sector. And we're using detailed quantitative research, real numbers, from Kisumu to map it out. We'll look at the physical flows, the economics, and something really interesting, the surprising environmental costs of this kind of parallel system.
It really is fascinating stuff because the data, well, it challenges a lot of common assumptions. We're going to take apart that common idea that informal water vendors are just, price gouging poor people. The findings might surprise you.
Yeah.
And we'll uncover this huge kind of hidden energy footprint that comes with certain way water gets delivered, sustaining daily life for really more than half the city.
Okay, let's start there. Let's dissect this dramatic difference in Kisumu. You can almost call it the two water cities, right? Formal versus informal. When we look at that official formal system, who's actually getting the water?
The formal reality is, well, it's extremely concentrated. The sources paint a really stark picture. Over 76% of the city's total accounted for water volume. It's consumed by less than 10% of the population.
76% for less than 10%.
Exactly. These are the households, the businesses that have water piped directly into their buildings. The privileged few, basically.
That is just a stunning imbalance. So if only 10% are formally served, how is the other 90% getting by? What does that informal reality look like on the ground?
It's a whole ecosystem of adaptation, really. I mean, across African cities, studies confirm this over half the population often relies heavily on this informal sector. And the reality in Kisumu is that the majority of residents just don't have enough water for basic things, safe hygiene, cooking, cleaning. It's a real struggle.
So within that informal system, you've got different players stepping up. What are the main types of businesses or actors the research identified?
It's a real mix. You have interfaces with the formal system, like water kiosks. These act as public collection points where people can buy water. Then you also have genuinely private, small-scale treatment plants. The study looked at one called Namasaria, operating independently, pumping and treating its own water.
Okay, so sources like kiosks and small plants, and then how does the water actually get to people's homes? The delivery part seems key.
Absolutely. And it's incredibly varied. A lot of it involves intense human labor. We're talking about water cart vendors. These are laborers using hand-drawn carts. But you also see mechanized options like water trucking companies, and then even more local bottled water sellers, and even people selling water in small plastic baggies.
Right, so it's a whole spectrum, from heavy machinery like trucks down to, just people pulling carts or carrying bottles.
And here's a critical point when you look at the volume of water versus who gets served. The informal sector, even though it accounts for less than 25% of the total water volume flowing in the city, the data confirms it serves more than 50% of the households.
Wow. Okay, so less than a quarter of the volume serves more than half the people.
Exactly. It's small volume doing the really heavy lifting for the majority. It's efficient in terms of reach, if not necessarily resource use.
That distinction, volume versus population served, that's so important for understanding how cities like this function, how they show resilience. Let's dig into that physical flow within the informal system now, specifically the labor involved. Because when we think of city water, we picture pumps, pipes, maybe trucks. But you're saying the reality in Kisumu relies heavily on, human muscle.
Overwhelmingly so. in some ways. The kiosks, as I mentioned, they're the main hub. They distribute something like 600 cubic meters of potable water daily within that informal network. But what's really counterintuitive is what happens next. A huge chunk of that water, especially from the kiosks and also the private plants, gets sold on to these water cart vendors.
The guys with the hand carts.
The guys with the hand
carts. So tell us the specific finding there. How much water are we talking about actually being moved by people pulling carts?
Get this. Over 30% of the total water coming out of those kiosks, it's roughly 200 cubic meters per day, is transported by these hand-drawn water carts.
200 cubic meters a day by hand cart.
It's a staggering reliance on human-powered logistics, just people physically pulling water through the city.
Okay, help us visualize that. 200 cubic meters by hand cart. How does that compare to the trucks, the mechanized alternative?
It absolutely dwarfs it. The volume moved by hand carts is nearly 5 times the volume transported by the mechanized water trucks. Trucks only move about 45 cubic meters per day in this informal system.
5 times more water moved by hand than by truck.
Yeah. So the sheer volume being moved by these unmechanized hand-drawn carts, it's really the foundation of water access for most people there.
That's an incredible data point. And if we pull back and think about broader development trends, this heavy reliance on human labor in Kisumu, it might be temporary, right?
Yeah.
We've seen in places like Latin America, as economies develop, there's often a shift towards more mechanized delivery, more trucking.
That's a common trajectory, yes. And it suggests that while human labor is dominant now, future improvements might mean more trucks on the road. Which brings us very neatly to the energy paradox. Because when you swap human muscle for diesel engines, well, the environmental cost, the energy cost per liter just goes through the roof.
Okay, let's talk about that. The cumulative energy demand, or CED.
Yeah.
That's basically the total energy needed from pulling water out of the ground or river, treating it, and getting it to someone's house, right? Excluding wastewater.
Exactly. That's the system boundary for this analysis.
You mentioned earlier that while the formal municipal system uses the most total energy, the informal sector is actually way less efficient when you look at energy per volume of water. How does that work?
Right. If you just look at the raw numbers, the big municipal treatment plants and pump stations, yes, they have the highest overall daily energy demand, around 21,000 megajoules a day. That's simply because they're moving the largest volume of water by far. But when you scale that energy use against how much water is actually produced or delivered, energy per cubic meter, the picture flips completely. The informal systems, especially certain parts of it, are incredibly energy inefficient.
Okay, let's nail that down. You mentioned the trucks. The study found that water delivery by truck is the absolute least resource-efficient way to move water in the entire city.
By a long shot. Truck delivery consumes about 35 megajoules per cubic meter. 35 MJ per cubic meter.
And what does that mean in practical terms? 35 megajoules.
Well, to put that in perspective, it's roughly the energy needed to power a small, efficient modern house for almost half a day, just to move 1 cubic meter of water by truck. It's an extraordinary energy sink.
Okay, that context makes the next statistic just unbelievable. Trucks transport less than 1% of the city's total water, this tiny fraction moved by diesel. Yet they consume nearly 20%, 1/5 of the total energy used by the entire municipal system. How is that even possible?
It's a function of a few things. Intermittency trucks don't run constantly. The long distances they might travel to serve specific, often wealthier customers. And just, poor logistics inherent in that kind of ad hoc private delivery system. And it's not just the trucks. That small private treatment plant in Nyamasaria, it's also notably inefficient compared to the big municipal utility, Kewasco. Likely because it lacks economies of scale, and it probably operates intermittently too, turning on and off based on immediate need or fuel availability.
So the implication here is pretty profound, isn't it? When the formal system fails and these parallel systems emerge, one relying on essentially cheap human labor for the majority, and another using inefficient, energy-guzzling trucks for those who can pay. The overall result is a massive increase in the total resources the city consumes just to get water around.
Exactly. You've got these two systems operating side by side, potentially doubling down on inefficiency in different ways. It's an environmental burden baked into the city's structure because equitable access failed in the first place.
Right, an environmental cost of inequality, essentially.
You could certainly frame it that way.
Okay, that sets us up perfectly for the next piece. the economics. We just established that the highly mechanized delivery, the trucking, is resource inefficient, energy intensive, and there's this common assumption, right, that in these high demand, low supply situations, informal vendors must be taking advantage, they must be price gouging. What did the market analysis actually find?
This is where the research really flips the script. It completely challenges that conventional wisdom. The study found, quite clearly, no evidence of price gouging.
No evidence at all.
No statistical evidence supporting that narrative. Now, water prices at the kiosks, they are highly variable. They range wildly from just 1 Kenyan shilling up to 40 shillings for the same 20-liter container, depending on the neighborhood.
Okay, huge variability, but not driven by gouging. So if it's not simple scarcity driving up the price where water is needed most, what is driving it? What explains that 1 to 40 shilling range?
Well, the data strongly suggests that pricing is not sensitive to demand in the way you might expect. Take the highest demand area, the low-income neighborhood called Manyatta. It's got the highest population density, the longest lines of people waiting for water, and yet that's where the lowest prices are charged.
The lowest prices where demand is highest.
Exactly. If vendors were purely maximizing profit based on scarcity, you'd expect the highest prices there where people are most desperate. But that's not what happens.
So if they're charging the least where the need seems greatest, what did the researchers conclude is actually setting the price?
The conclusion, looking at the neighborhood-level data, is that pricing seems highly responsive to the perceived ability to pay of the customer base in that area. Where were the highest prices found? In the central market area, serving small businesses who presumably have more cash flow, and in the wealthier southern neighborhoods.
Ah, okay. So they're charging more where people or businesses can afford to pay more, rather than just jacking up prices in the poorest areas with the longest queues.
That appears to be the mechanism. It's less about exploiting raw scarcity and more about sort of segmenting the market based on what it can bear, maximizing revenue by charging different prices to different groups.
That completely changes how you might think about this informal market. It's not necessarily predatory in the way often assumed. Did the source of the water matter for the price? Like, was water from the municipal tap sold at kiosks cheaper than water from a private borehole?
Generally, there wasn't a clear, consistent trend across all the different neighborhoods studied. It wasn't straightforward. In one specific area, yes, groundwater from a borehole was significantly more expensive. But broadly speaking, the source seemed less important to the price than the sort of socioeconomic profile of the neighborhood being served.
So the price is tied more to the customer than the water itself in many cases.
That seems to be the pattern, yes.
The sensitivity to ability to pay is a really crucial insight. But it brings us back to the hard reality for people relying on this system. Even if they aren't being aggressively price gouged, the fact remains, right? Households buying water informally use less water per person than people with a tap in their home.
Absolutely. That's a critical finding. And that is the ultimate danger here. When per capita consumption drops below certain essential levels, the health risks just skyrocket. If you don't have enough water for basic hygiene, for safe cooking, for drinking, the likelihood of waterborne diseases, things like cholera or typhoid, it just goes way up. So the informal sector, yes, it keeps people alive. It provides essential access. But it often forces them into a quantity restriction that puts their health fundamentally at risk.
Okay, so let's try and summarize the key takeaways for the listener from this deep dive into Kisumu's water situation. First off, the informal water sector isn't some fringe activity. It's absolutely essential. It's the engine keeping more than half the population going, filling this massive gap left by the formal utility.
Definitely. It meets a critical, unmet need. But, as we saw, that necessity comes with two major costs. First, it's less resource efficient overall, particularly the mechanized parts like trucking, which burn enormous amounts of energy for very small volumes of water delivered. And second, while the pricing might not be simple gouging, it seems sensitive to ability to pay the end result, is still that the majority of residents are forced to use less water daily, potentially falling below levels needed for good health.
And that core insight about the pricing really stood out to me, that the cost of water in these informal markets seems to reflect what vendors think consumers can actually afford, more than just a reaction to scarcity. It's like an unintentional social buffer almost, built into a broken system.
It's a fascinating dynamic, and it leads to maybe one final provocative thought, building on that energy data we discussed. The study did a brilliant job quantifying the energy used by the machines, the diesel for the trucks, the electricity for the pumps. But it explicitly excluded the energy source that moves 5 times more water than the trucks. Human labor. the energy exerted by those cart vendors. If we could somehow quantify that, the sheer human energy expenditure required every single day just to provide basic water access for most of Kisumu, what would the true total cumulative energy demand of that city look like? And what would that tell us about the real hidden human cost of system failure? Something for you to think about.